There comes a moment in the life of an empathy where exhaustion can no longer be masked by smiles, where the weight of carrying everyone else's pain turns into a quiet rebellion. Imagine sitting alone after yet another day of absorbing other people's moods, saying yes when your body screamed no, offering comfort while your own chest tightens under invisible burdens. Jung suggested that real consciousness often begins not with grand realizations but with small, radical questions. For the empathy, it is the whisper, "What if I stopped?" That question is terrifying precisely because it unravels a lifetime of conditioning. From childhood, many empaths were praised for their sensitivity, but Jung would argue that this was not true empathy, it was survival sensitivity, a hypervigilant scanning of emotional landscapes born from trauma, chaos, or unpredictable caregivers. What looks like a gift is often a shield forged in fire. When the empathy first recognizes this, they don't simply become more aware, they experience what Jung described as a collision with the unconscious. It's a violent meeting with the truth that the self they performed, the one endlessly giving, endlessly smoothing over conflict, was never truly theirs. The shock is akin to watching a beloved mask shatter. Jung's writings on individuation describe this as a critical threshold. The empathy realizes that their identity has been built on a lie, the lie that they are responsible for everyone else's feelings. This realization doesn't make them cruel, it makes them dangerous to systems and relationships that depended on their self-erasure. The shadow begins to surface, and in the empathy's shadow, Jung saw something society rarely expects: rage. Not cruelty, but the pure, undiluted anger of a person who has been used, manipulated, and taken for granted. This rage is not to be feared. In fact, Jung insisted that enlightenment comes not from imagining light but from making the darkness conscious. For the empathy, the darkness is not evil, it is the reservoir of their denied needs, their unheard voice, their silenced no. Meeting this shadow is the beginning of their liberation. But this process is neither gentle nor linear. In my own reading of Jung's psychology, what makes this stage so revolutionary is its refusal to romanticize awakening. Spiritual circles often speak of awakening as blissful, but Jung was precise: it is disruptive, disorienting, and sometimes terrifying. For empaths, the clarity that follows can feel cold at first. They begin to see manipulation tactics that were previously invisible: the friend who always has a crisis when you start prioritizing yourself, the partner who guilt trips you into caretaking, the colleague who thrives on your compliance. This newfound perception isn't cynicism, it's clarity sharpened by pain. In Jungian terms, it is the psyche reclaiming its energy from unconscious projection. What's remarkable is that this moment doesn't just affect the empathy individually, it ripples outward. The empathy begins to resist being the emotional sponge of their family, workplace, or community. Systems that once relied on their endless giving begin to tremble. Jung understood that individuation is threatening not because it harms others, but because it exposes the unconscious contracts that relationships are built upon. Many connections survive only because one person endlessly gives while the other endlessly takes. When the empathy refuses to play their part, the imbalance becomes undeniable. To expand this, let's consider how society at large profits from unweakened empaths. Consumer culture thrives on guilt, convincing people to buy worthiness through service and sacrifice. Workplaces exploit employees who never complain, never say no, and take on everyone else's stress. Even families often valorize the selfless one while quietly draining them. When Jung described individuation as the most threatening act in a collective society, this is what he meant: to become sovereign is to stop feeding systems that rely on your unconscious compliance. The empathy's awakening is therefore not just personal but political. It is an act of quiet revolution. This is why the shadow must be integrated. If the empathy refuses to face their anger, they risk collapsing back into old patterns, repeating cycles of depletion. But if they dare to listen to that anger, they discover its message: you matter too. In Jung's framework, the shadow holds not just darkness but energy, raw vitality that can be reclaimed and directed. The empathy who reclaims their shadow doesn't become selfish, they become selective. They begin to channel their sensitivity with intention. They can spot the difference between genuine suffering and emotional vampirism. They can feel compassion without collapsing under it. This transition is what Jung might call the move from unconscious empathy to conscious empathy. From a modern perspective, this stage parallels what psychologists call boundary formation. Yet Jung goes deeper than simple self-help advice. He argues that boundaries aren't walls, they are expressions of integrity. The empathy is not withdrawing from the world, they are finally entering it as themselves. The difference is profound. Instead of asking how can I ease your discomfort, they begin to ask what is authentic for me in this moment. And strangely, this shift doesn't make them less compassionate. It makes their compassion sustainable. So, the first stage of awakening is brutal but necessary. It's the collapse of the false self, the shattering of the survival strategy masquerading as identity. It is the descent into shadow, the meeting with rage, and the recognition of manipulation. But in this collapse lies the seed of sovereignty. As Jung wrote, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For the empathy, this privilege begins the moment they stop being afraid of their own shadow. When Jung wrote about individuation, he wasn't merely describing a philosophical ideal, he was documenting the raw and painful process of human beings learning to return to themselves. For empaths, this stage is especially turbulent because their very identity has been wrapped around serving others. Once the false self begins to collapse, what emerges is not immediate peace but a radical reordering of energy and priorities. Jung observed that highly sensitive individuals undergo distinct transformations, and while his terminology comes from early 20th century psychology, the experiences he described remain strikingly familiar to modern empaths. What I call the 8 signs of conscious awakening aren't just abstract ideas, they are lived shifts, felt in the body, mind, and relationships. The first is the energy reversal. Imagine energy as a river. For years, the empathy as river has flowed outward, nourishing everyone else's gardens while leaving their own soil cracked and dry. When individuation begins, the current changes. Energy stops being siphoned away by unconscious guilt and starts pooling back into the self. This isn't selfishness, it's the restoration of balance. Jung noticed that patients in this stage suddenly stopped feeling drained after social interactions. They became aware of the subtle ways they had been leaking life force through appeasement, through compulsive caretaking, through absorbing moods that weren't theirs. For the empathy, this reversal feels almost like a rebirth. More sleep, more clarity, more capacity to listen to their own inner signals. Others often sense this shift before the empathy does. People accustomed to their endless availability feel unsettled, sometimes even betrayed, because their emotional dumping ground has closed for business. The second sign is what Jung called the death of the persona, the falling away of the social mask. The empathy as mask is usually the nice one, the reliable one, the one who always says yes. But masks are heavy, and individuation makes them unbearable. The empathy begins to speak honestly, sometimes haltingly at first, and the words land like small earthquakes. Instead of automatic agreement, there's hesitation. Instead of a polite smile, there's a quiet frown that says, I disagree. Instead of endless energy, there's an admission, I'm tired. This small authenticity terrifies those who have long relied on the mask. Jung warned that the most frightening act is to accept oneself completely, and for the empathy, this means allowing their true preferences, needs, and fatigue to come into the open. The third sign is the projection recall. Jung theorized that projection is inevitable, we see in others what we cannot yet accept in ourselves. Empaths often project their own depth and compassion onto others, assuming that everyone has the same sincerity. But awakening pulls back the veil. Suddenly, the empathy stops romanticizing selfish behavior as misunderstood pain and begins to see manipulation for what it is. This can be devastating. Many relationships were sustained on the empathy's ability to imagine potential where none existed. But projection recall restores reality. As Jung wrote, Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. The irritation at someone's selfishness, for example, can reveal the empathy's long denied need for healthy self-interest. The fourth sign is sacred boundaries. At this stage, empaths begin to understand that no is not cruelty but integrity. Jung described individuation as forming a personal relationship with the unconscious, which for empaths means finally listening to their inner signals instead of overriding them to keep the peace. Saying no without elaborate justification becomes liberating. The guilt that used to follow boundaries begins to dissolve, which is the fifth sign. This guilt was never natural, it was a conditioned response to manipulation. Once empaths integrate their shadow, they realize that guilt was often a leash held by those who benefited from their overgiving. Now, when someone accuses them of changing, they can respond internally with calm acceptance, "Yes, I have, and that's the point." The sixth sign is authenticity over approval. For years, empaths measured safety through the smiles and reassurances of others. Approval was their oxygen. But individuation makes authenticity more vital than external validation. They stop laughing at unfunny jokes, stop pretending to agree, stop contorting themselves to maintain harmony. This authenticity is magnetic for some and threatening for others, but either way, it cannot be ignored. The seventh sign involves the wounded healer turning inward. Jung noticed that many people who heal others do so because they are avoiding their own wounds. Empaths, often natural healers, pour energy outward to avoid facing their own emptiness. But individuation demands reversal. For the first time, the empathy asks, "What do I need?" This is not selfish, it is necessary. The inner child, long ignored, becomes the new focus of care. This shift often leads to profound physical healing as well, because the body has been carrying emotional toxins for years. Finally, the eighth sign is conscious connection. Jung described this as relating to others without losing oneself. For empaths, it means learning what I call boundaried compassion, the ability to feel with others without being consumed by their pain. They begin attracting relationships rooted in respect rather than exploitation, authenticity rather than performance. They love not to save, but to connect. What makes these 8 signs so transformative is not that they elevate the empathy into some untouchable spiritual state, but that they bring the empathy back to the ordinary ground of selfhood. The empathy becomes a full human being capable of saying no, of being irritated, of resting, of choosing, of feeling their own needs without drowning in shame. Jung never suggested that individuation was about perfection. It is about wholeness, the integration of all parts of the psyche, even those we once denied. For the empathy, individuation is not a departure from sensitivity but the evolution of it. Sensitivity becomes conscious, no longer a survival strategy but a superpower directed with clarity. This stage, however, is fragile. Jung likened it to a death and rebirth cycle, where the old structures must collapse before the new self fully stabilizes. That is why these 8 signs often appear in waves, repeating at deeper levels. One day, the empathy feels liberated by boundaries, the next, they are tempted back into guilt. One day, they embrace authenticity, the next, they long for approval. This oscillation is not failure but the spiral nature of growth. Each return to the old pattern provides an opportunity to embody the new truth more deeply. In my interpretation, the 8 signs represent a psychological rite of passage. The empathy is not simply becoming less nice or more selfish. They are becoming sovereign. Their energy is no longer a resource for unconscious systems, it is a wellspring for their own becoming. This sovereignty terrifies those who depended on their compliance, but it liberates those who long to follow. Jung understood that individual transformation is contagious. The empathy who claims their selfhood becomes a lighthouse for others trapped in cycles of self-abandonment. The 8 signs, then, are not just personal milestones, they are sparks of collective awakening. If the 8 signs of awakening mark the early steps of individuation, then what follows is the descent into shadow, a phase that Jung considered unavoidable, but also one of the most perilous. For empaths, This is not an abstract journey into mythological darkness, it is the very real experience of meeting the parts of themselves they have long suppressed. While the early awakening feels liberating, even exhilarating, the shadow descent is sobering. It strips away illusions not just about others, but about oneself. Jung warned repeatedly that the shadow is not evil in itself, it is everything we reject, deny, or refuse to integrate. For the empathy, the shadow often includes anger, resentment, selfishness, and the hunger for recognition, all traits they were taught to view as dangerous. From childhood, many empaths internalized the idea that to be loved they had to be endlessly giving, endlessly patient, endlessly kind. Their shadow, then, holds the fiery impulses they buried, the scream they never allowed themselves to voice, the rage at being overlooked, the bitter wish that someone would finally care for them. When individuation deepens, these impulses surface. And here lies the danger, because empaths have no practice holding anger, the first eruptions can feel overwhelming. They may lash out suddenly, shocking themselves and others. Or they may spiral into guilt, terrified that these impulses prove they are bad. But Jung insisted that the shadow must be faced, not erased. To deny it is to remain fragmented. To embrace it is to reclaim power. Consider the empathy who, for years, tolerated a manipulative partner out of fear of conflict. When the shadow rises, their suppressed fury may burst forth. At first, this feels destabilizing. But within the fury lies truth, the recognition that they deserve respect, that their needs matter. Shadow work teaches the empathy that anger can be a guardian, not a destroyer. As Jung put it, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The descent is not only emotional but also relational. Many connections collapse at this stage. People who benefited from the empathy's passivity are suddenly confronted with a new person who refuses to play the old role. Friends, partners, even family members may accuse them of being selfish, cold, or unrecognizable. This backlash is painful, and without understanding, the empathy may be tempted to retreat back into the mask. Yet the loss is necessary. Shadow work is a purification of relationships, it reveals who can meet the empathy as a whole being and who only loved the mask. The psychological toll can be intense. Nightmares, mood swings, and sudden grief often accompany the shadow phase. Jung observed that dreams become particularly vivid, serving as messages from the unconscious. Empaths may dream of being chased, drowning, or confronting monsters, all symbolic encounters with their denied emotions. Instead of fearing these dreams, individuation invites them to engage with them. Each monster represents a truth long silenced. To face the monster is to reclaim the silenced self. It is here that the empathy must learn discernment. Shadow integration is not about indulging every suppressed impulse, but about understanding its message. Anger, when integrated, becomes assertiveness. Envy becomes recognition of unclaimed desires. Resentment becomes clarity about boundaries. The task is to listen without judgment, to allow the shadow to inform without dominating. This is delicate work, and Jung himself admitted that few people complete it fully. But even partial integration transforms the empathy from a fragile giver into a balanced human capable of both tenderness and strength. There is also a spiritual dimension to this descent. Many empaths report feeling abandoned by their previous sense of connection, whether to God, the universe, or their own intuition. This spiritual dryness echoes what mystics call the dark night of the soul. Jung understood it as the psyche withdrawing projections. For years, empaths projected their own inner wisdom outward, onto mentors, lovers, or spiritual systems. The shadow descent demands that they reclaim this wisdom as their own. The silence is not absence but an invitation to listen more deeply to the self. The paradox of the shadow is that it feels like collapse but actually strengthens the foundation. Each confrontation with denied parts of the self builds resilience. No longer terrified of anger, the empathy can express it without losing control. No longer ashamed of envy, they can pursue their true desires. No longer crushed by guilt, they can stand firm in their boundaries. The descent, then, is not the end of sensitivity but its maturation. In a broader sense, the shadow phase mirrors cultural transformation. Empaths who integrate their shadow often become powerful voices for justice, refusing to placate systems that thrive on silence. Their personal anger becomes collective courage. Their refusal to self-abandon becomes an example that ripples outward. Jung's insight was that individuation is not just personal therapy but also cultural renewal. Each person who integrates their shadow weakens the hold of unconscious forces on society. Yet Jung was also realistic. He knew that the shadow cannot be conquered once and for all. It continues to evolve, to reveal new layers, to demand new integration. The goal is not to eradicate the shadow but to establish a dialogue with it. For empaths, this means lifelong practice, listening to their inner storms, naming their resentments, acknowledging their cravings, and responding with honesty instead of repression. This ongoing relationship creates wholeness. In the end, the shadow descent is both terrifying and liberating. It dismantles illusions, exposes wounds, and strips away false security. But it also births a new kind of strength, not the brittle strength of denial, but the flexible strength of authenticity. Jung knew that the treasure is always hidden in the cave we fear to enter. For empaths, that cave is filled with anger, need, and self-assertion. And when they dare to enter, they discover that what they feared most was not their destruction but their liberation.